to lifelong learning at Wagon Library. I'm librarian Joyce Ellison. It's time to celebrate Juneteenth, our newest federal holiday. Juneteenth commemorates the ending of slavery in the United States. It was on June 19, 1865, that enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, learned they were free. This was 2 months after the Civil War ended and more than 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, the news set off a celebration that has become an annual event. This Juneteenth, we're in conversation with Annie McGriff. Mrs. McGriff is a Morris Brown University graduate who earned a master's in education from Fort Valley State University. For 42 years, Annie was a teacher and a counselor in Dooley and Pulaski counties. Now retired, she delights in reading with her granddaughter Abby and in her quilting group, the Crafty Stitchers. Mrs. McGriff learned to piece quilts at her mother's knee. But in adulthood, Annie also has learned how various quilt patterns have been used as symbols for ideas throughout history. In this Juneteenth season, Mrs. McGriff will explore how Charleston quilter Ozella McDaniel Williams handed down coded messages in quilt patterns. Annie's presentation is based on the book, Hidden in Plain View, A Secret Story of Quilts and the Underground Railroad by Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond Dobard. And Annie will be assisted today by Lillian Lawson. Now here's Annie.
Thank you, Miss Joyce. Yes, I am a quilter. Not an expert quilter, not a novice. I fall somewhere in between. I became interested in quilts as a young girl. Oh, I was always fascinated with the beautiful quilts that covered the beds in the homes of elderly neighbors in our community. I would often ask questions about the patterns of the quilts, the fabrics, and the motifs on those quilts. Each quilt had its own story, and those ladies always enjoyed sharing those stories with me. Sometimes the quilt was a special gift for someone. Sometimes it was made for a special occasion, but they were all very, very special. Now, my mother taught me to quilt when I was a little girl. When winter came, all was frozen. There were no more crops in the fields. We would sit around a big furnace in the middle of our home and piece quilts at night. At first, my job was simply to thread the needle. Then I graduated to sorting the scraps, sometimes cutting them into squares or long strings. My mama made what we call she did the best she could quilts. She did the best she could quilt is a quilt that was made from whatever fabrics could be found around the home. And at my house, it was almost always outgrown clothes that still had just enough material left in it that it could be used to make a quilt. My mama's quilts were made solely to keep her body warm, but sometimes she was blessed to acquire lengths of colorful cotton fabric. When she did, she made beautiful string quilts. and today I share that love of making string quilts. Some of my quilts are here with me today, and they are indeed string quilts. Although I do purchase new fabrics, I often cut those pieces into lengths to make string quilts. A special quilt is also here with me today. This quilt was pieced by my paternal grandmother, Grandma Ida. We know that this quilt is almost 80 years old. I've had the quilt in my possession about 30 years. It is old and faded, as you can see, but it was hand-pieced. It has stood the test of time. There are no tears or rips in it at all. Now, my grandmother was a very, very religious woman, and in her quilt, in keeping with an old Amish tradition, she acknowledged that there's only one supreme being, and only that being is perfect. So she put a deliberate mistake in her quilt, and she did this in all of her quilts, and that's something I'll always remember. So when I'm making my quilts and mistakes show up, they may not be deliberate, but it reminds me that I am not perfect. I just do the very best that I can. Now, about a year and a half ago, I came to this very library looking for a book to do a character education lesson with my granddaughter. I was looking for a book called Josephine and the Story Quilt. It was not available in this library, but Miss Joyce said, "Oh, I can get that for you." And that started us talking about quilts and my interest in them, and the fact that I work with a group of quilters here in Pulaski County. She told me that she had heard of a book, and in this book, a slave code was discussed. It was described in detail, and it was said that slaves used the codes in these quilts to navigate the Underground Railroad. Oh, was I interested in that. And of course she said, "I can get that book for you too." I was delighted. And very soon the book was in my hand. And I started reading, and I could not put that book down. Now, according to Miss McDaniels, Miss Ozella McDaniel, the quilt originated with a seamstress who was a slave on some plantation. She was very skilled, and she used her skills and the scraps of fabric that were left over from the garments and quilts that she made for the family to make this quilt. When she made the quilt, she selected certain slaves to share this information with. Now, she couldn't tell everybody because it was a secret. And if that secret had gotten out, that would have undermined the Underground Railroad itself. So now, before I begin, I want to give you a word of caution about the book. It's the subject of much controversy. Many people say it could not have happened the way it is described by Miss Ozella. But there are others say, "Oh, yes, it could." And so there's a debate back and forth. But I love the book, and if you read it, even if you can't make up your mind which way to go, there's a lot of food for thought in there. But before I get started, let me tell you something about the slaves themselves. Now, the slave community was basically divided into two parts by the master. There were slaves on the inside of the big house, and there were slaves on the outside of the big house. And they all had different jobs. There were basically three type plantations. We had sugar plantations, cotton plantations, and rice plantations. different fruit. These were the three basic. Now, the slaves couldn't just sit around and do absolutely nothing. They all had jobs. This is the picture of a nurse. Another nurse. This is a field worker. And believe it or not, this man was an overseer. He oversaw the work of the other slaves, and of course reported back to the master when they did not do what they were supposed to do. This is a slave couple. And this is a slave who was the butler for the house. The slaves lived in housing, sometimes, all times I should say, with the exception of the slaves who lived in the big house. The housing was inadequate. Usually just shanties, lean-to, or sometimes a barrack where all of the slaves lived together. Now, there were nurses, midwives, cooks, carpenters, millwrights, seamstresses, blacksmiths, gladiators. Believe it or not, there were gladiators. And these men were similar to wrestlers in our day and time. Yes, they were used for sport, and many of them were forced to fight to the death. There were drivers, preachers, stable workers, butchers, tanners, and many, many, many other jobs. As I was thinking about this presentation and just reading that book, I looked for my own benefit for evidence to see if this information could possibly be true. And this is what I found. There were people who were former slaves who talked about their experiences after slavery was over. There were runaways who actually made it to safety, and they told their stories. In the 1930s, when the economy was really, really, really bad and many, many people lost their jobs, a Works Projects Administration was founded. And the purpose of this project was to give people work so that they could earn a living. And many of them worked interviewing former slaves who were brought to the United States and runaways who had escaped. These slaves told their stories in their own words. In 1858 and 1859 respectively, 2 slave ships, the Wanderer and the Cotillion, brought the last load of slaves to the United States. Probably wasn't the last load, but it's the last documented load. These people were interviewed, and they told a vivid story because it was from experience. And this appears in a book from this project called The Slave Narrative. Okay, in 1990, another book was written, and it was called Stitched from the Soul, and into included interviews of some of these people. That book is authored by Gladys Marie Fry. Then in 1999, Hidden in Plain View, co-authored by Raymond DeWard Jr. and Jacqueline Tobin, appeared on the scene. These 2 authors chronicle what Miss Ozella had told them into this wonderful book. And now I would like to share with you some of the codes. One of the codes, the monkey wrench. This code said to the slaves, gather all of the tools that that you're going to use on this journey. Now, the tools had to be very, very small things because they're running away now. And many times it was just clothes on their very backs, or maybe a piece of flint rock, or maybe some small tool or instrument that they had fashioned for self-defense or for hunting food. The wagon wheel. This was a pattern that was displayed on a fence, maybe a porch, a bush outside of a particular home, that said the wheels will be turning very soon. Many slaves escaped in wagons that had false bottoms. You see, you have to understand there were slave sympathizers who helped them to escape. So when the wheels were going to turn, that said to the slaves, somebody's coming in a wagon, you got to be ready. There's a false bottom, you got to crawl into it, and you will be headed to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Another symbol in the code was the bear's paw. You can learn a lot from animals. The bear's paw said, if you follow the path of the bear, you will find food and you will find water. You know, bears love to eat fish, for one thing. Raw fish may not be good to me or you now, but if you were a slave and you were running, it would have been wonderful to have been able to find food and water in the same place. So the bear's paw was very important. Then there's the crossroads. That is the crossroad. Once through the mountains and the woods, the slaves were to travel to the crossroads. The main crossroads were Cleveland, Ohio, and any quilts that were hung before this one was leading to this point, to Ohio. The next one was the log cabin. Now, the log cabin at the very center has a red square. That's a symbol of the hearth of the home. If a slave saw a quilt bearing this symbol, then that said this is a safe house. You can stop here. People here will help you. Now, while I'm talking about this, I'm going to tell you at this point that each one of these blocks represents an entire quilt. You would not find a quilt with all of these at one time, except maybe when the seamstress first made the quilt and used it for teaching purposes. The next one is called shoe fly. Now let's think about shoe fly. Very little information is out there about shoe fly, but it is believed that shoe fly was a person who actually might have aided escaping slaves and helping them find their way. Shoe fly could have been a person like a June bug. There's a June bug in almost every community. There's a big boy. These people who are just there, and everybody likes them, and they just kind of go on about that way. You know, nobody thinks anything about, oh, there's a June bug. Go away, shoe fly. But these people are actually very, very smart people giving out information to the slaves. You got to get ready. Thus and such is about to happen. And you see, a June bug or a shoe fly could probably move from one plantation to the next without anybody being suspicious of anything. The next pattern is the bow tie. Now, the bow tie was a pattern that said to the slave, if you see this at a home, clothes to wear. Think about it. Slaves traveling through the bushes, and on the ground, and through the weather. Their clothes were most always very tattered and torn. But there were free slaves about too. And if a slave could get a new set of clothes, they could disguise themselves as a free person, and thus maybe continue on the Underground Railroad. Flying geese. This pattern told the slave to follow migrating geese north toward Canada and to freedom. This was a directional pattern. You see, most of these patterns, all of them, in fact, deal with things that would have been familiar to the slaves. The next one is the drunkard's path. It was a zigzag pattern, and it said to the slave, don't walk a straight line. If you walk a straight line, you're going to leave a trail. But if you zigzag, you're going to throw the dogs and the slave hunters off trail. Sometimes the people would actually have to double back. That was a very important one. And the last one that we have here is the North Star. Now, I talked about flying geese and other things maybe that the slaves could see during the day. But what you gonna do at night? Well, the North Star. They all knew the North Star. There was a song about it. Follow the drinking goal. You remember? The drinking goal, and at the end of it is this bright star, but it's always pointing to the north. And so the slaves could use this at night. Now that is the story as I read it in the book. I was intrigued by it. I've done a little bit of further study, and I encourage you, if you're interested in this kind of thing, or just want to enjoy a book, get your hands on that book. It provides food for thought, and it is just wonderful. And I do appreciate our librarian, Ms. Joyce, for getting that book for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, for giving us a glimpse into those quilted messages. They became an important roadmap to freedom. And Annie, your mother taught you so well your own needlework